All right, so in this video, we're going to be covering some nutrition basics. Of course, if we want to be eating healthy food, the first step is to know what is quote unquote healthy food. So first, we're going to define healthy. And I know that this is confusing to a lot of people. This is confusing to average Americans. This is confusing to patients. This is even very, very confusing to many providers and physicians, right? So we're all confused about what is and what isn't healthy. And that's the goal of this first video. So what I like to do is instead of saying what's the best diet, let's look at all of these diets that we know have good evidence and say what do they have in common. So you've probably heard of course, the Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet, perhaps from the PreDiMed study if you're in the medical field, or if you're not, you're familiar with the Mediterranean diet, which looks something like this. Everyone knows this is very good for heart health, right? There's also the DASH diet. So the DASH diet, everyone thinks of cutting back on sodium, salt, right? But there's also many other components that you see here that are included in the DASH diet. The USDA's MyPlate, you may love it or perhaps love to hate it, but it looks something like this, where half your plate is fruits and vegetables. The other half of your plate is grains and proteins. And then there's some dairy on the side. No comment about how that got there, including the dairy lobby. And then there's a slightly, I would say, more evidence-based version of this plate that I like to recommend to patients and that I use when I'm teaching providers, which is called the Harvard Diet's Healthy Eating Plate. So this comes from the Nutrition Source, which is a website hosted through the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And they have amazing resources, not only for people like us who are looking to eat healthy, but also for providers who are looking to educate their patients on how to eat healthy. Lots of primary literature cited in there if you're a graduate or professional student who's really tied to the evidence, right? Don't worry, you will be satiated, pun intended, if you look at this website. And for everyone else who just wants the plain, simple language of how to eat healthy, I think this does a great job of showing it. As you can see, it has a lot of similarities to the USDA's MyPlate. Half the plate is fruits and vegetables. The other half is grains and proteins. But as you can see, it specifies that we should be consuming mostly whole grains, right? Grains that have fiber and extra healthy fats and some micronutrients in there as well. And then as far as healthy proteins, it goes on to define that using a variety of verbs. You see choose or limit or avoid. Those verbs allude to the amount of research that we have. Are these things really promoting our health? Are we not really sure, or maybe we should limit them, or are we sure that they're really not that good for us and we should try to avoid them as much as possible? In that avoid category is one of my favorite proteins, bacon. Delicious, yes. Healthy, no. You notice there's no dairy on the side. That's a kind of optional liquid that you can consume throughout the day, but it's not required. There are many places throughout the world where people do not consume dairy, and they're not all getting osteoporotic fractures and dying at young ages, right? This is an optional part of our diet. But water, that's mandatory. So you see that on the side, as well as some healthy oils. So they go on to define healthy oils as oils that are high in unsaturated fatty acids, and those are fatty acids that are liquid at room temperature. So you can tell this is probably my favorite. There's a plate that also looks similar that is represented by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine's pictorial here, and this is a whole food plant-based diet. So the difference here is that all of our proteins are plant-based proteins, and in our most extreme form of the whole food plant-based diet, there's no added salt, oil, or sugar. But as you can see, looks relatively similar to the other plates that we've seen. So these are all very much evidence-based diets. They are shown to improve both disease-specific and all-cause morbidity and mortality, particularly heart disease, lowering our risk of diabetes, lowering our blood pressure and our blood cholesterol, things like that. So these are the dietary components. And the question is, what do all of these diets have in common? Because if these are all our evidence-based diets, they must have something in common. What is really conferring those health-promoting benefits when we eat these diets? And the answer is plants. Probably unsurprisingly, plants are extremely healthy. They promote health in a variety of ways through fiber, through the water content. They're difficult to overeat because they take up so much volume in our stomach, right? They have tons of antioxidants and active plant chemicals that help to combat inflammation and chronic disease. Plants, unsurprisingly, very healthy. The more we can eat of them, the better. So if that's healthy, then let's think about the other end of the spectrum and say, okay, if plants are healthy, what's unhealthy, right? And so let me show you the most unhealthy diet known to man, the standard American diet, or SAD for short. So the components of a standard American diet are, in general, we consume too much energy. And by that I mean we consume about 500 calories more per day than our bodies need on average. So excess of energy. We consume a lot of red and processed meats. So according to the World Health Organization, red meats are considered to be probably carcinogenic, and these processed meats are considered to be carcinogenic, right? So we eat a lot of those in our diet. We also eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods are high in sodium, which raises our blood pressure. They're high in fat, often saturated fat, because saturated fat tastes really good on the tongue and it helps to improve shelf life. But saturated fat is what's linked to raising our LDL, or our bad cholesterol. They also have lots of added sugars, and we know that this can be directly toxic to our endothelial lining, so the linings of our vasculature, our blood vessels, and it causes us to release more insulin, of course. It can also lead to weight gain. And then refined grains, so not those whole grains that we saw on the Harvard healthy eating plate, but refined grains, grains where they've taken out the fiber, they've taken out the healthy fats, they've taken out those micronutrients, and you're just left with starch, which is converted quickly in the body into sugar. So lots of refined grains. So when we look at the standard American diet, what's missing? Plants. So we don't eat many plants. But I want to take a closer look at these ultra-processed foods. This is something that a lot of people are asking more and more questions about. We're more and more familiar with this term, but what exactly is an ultra-processed food? So this term was defined along with the NOVA classification, in which it's included, in 2009. So we've had this term really not that long, about 15 years. It takes all foods that are available for us to eat, and it groups them into 4 groups according to the level of processing. If you look at group 1, these are unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So you have an apple, you pick it off the tree. You have some cauliflower, you cut it into tiny bits into cauliflower rice. That's an unprocessed food, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have group 4, which are these ultra-processed foods. These are foods that are made using industrial ingredients. So they're made in a factory. You cannot make these foods in your home kitchen because you just don't have the ingredients to make them. So a few of my favorite, personally, ultra-processed foods, Funyuns, Oreos, things of that nature, right? Not saying they're good for you. I'm saying they're my favorite because they're delicious. So we consume a lot of ultra-processed foods here in the United States. In fact, they make up about 57% of our daily calories. So more than half of what we eat every day, calorie-wise, is coming from ultra-processed foods. In fact, we lead the world, as you can see, in the consumption of ultra-processed foods. There's a few countries coming up close behind, but again, we consume more of these ultra-processed foods than anywhere else in the world. And as a result, we have a lot of cardiometabolic disease. So again, these foods have only been, this classification system has only been around for the past 15 or so years, but the data has mounted now recently to the point where we're allowed to do meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And what we see in all of these advanced review studies is that they're associated with negative cardiometabolic outcomes. So we know that these ultra-processed foods are really not doing much in good for our health. So we've talked about what's healthy, we've talked about what's unhealthy, quote unquote, and now what are we to do about it? So my favorite diet that I like to talk to patients and providers about is a plant-forward dietary pattern. So a plant-forward dietary pattern essentially emphasizes eating a lot of plants, but not necessarily to the exclusion of animal products. You can still eat some animal products, right? But when you do so, it's generally for flavor or to celebrate or to get some more protein if you're focused on that, right? And in general, we're saying that the health-promoting components of our diet come from plants, and we should eat as many of those as possible. So it's a quite inclusive and flexible way of eating that still, I think, follows the science. These plant-forward dietary patterns, some of which we talked about earlier, have been repeatedly shown to improve all-cause and disease-specific, again, morbidity and mortality. So what does a plant-forward dietary pattern look like? Of course, eating more fruits and vegetables. Everyone knows that those are good for us. The more of those we can eat, the better. Decreasing those ultra-processed foods, particularly if they're hyper-palatable, meaning that they're high in salt, sugar, fat, or at least 2 of those 3. If a food is ultra-processed and hyper-palatable, there's a good chance it's not doing much for us. And in the 1980s, we would have called those junk foods. So decreasing those where we're able to. Taking sources of saturated fat in the diet and substituting those out and instead bringing in unsaturated fats, hugely, hugely beneficial for our health. So saturated fats, solid at room temperature. Those come from tropical oils like palm, palm kernel, and coconut oil, and instead using unsaturated fats, so fats that are liquid at room temperature. Refined carbohydrates, we talked about how those are converted into sugar more rapidly in the body compared to whole grains, which have fiber as well as those beneficial micronutrients and some healthy fats. Minimizing added sugars, there's very little that everyone in the nutrition community can always agree on, and this is one of them. We really should minimize our added sugars in the diet. Decreasing dietary sodium, so the salt that we eat, can lower our blood pressure. That's extremely helpful for morbidity and mortality. And then taking our sources of animal-based protein and swapping them out for sources of plant-based protein. So lentils and legumes, whole grains have protein in them. Tofu and other sources of plant-based protein are in general healthier for us compared to animal-based proteins, one of the reasons of which is that they have less saturated fat. And finally, we should pay attention to those ratios. So if you think back to those plates that we looked at earlier, half the plate is fiber-rich fruits and vegetables. About a quarter of the plate are whole grains and starches, and then that last quarter is lean protein. So putting it all together again, or alternatively, if all of this is just too much and you want some simple way to remember this, this is how I like to represent it. We know kind of these two opposing pillars of nutrition. One is that whole and minimally processed plants are unequivocally good for us. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. We should try to eat as many of those as possible. These ultra-processed foods on the other end, which are high in things like salt, sugar, saturated fat, and refined carbohydrates, those are probably not improving our health. The goal is wherever you find yourself for a particular meal, a particular day, a particular season of your life, is to say, where am I on this guideline and how can I move more towards the whole plant side of things, right? How can I consume fewer ultra-processed foods and consume more whole plants? And have some self-love and understanding in this, right? If you're in graduate school, this is a very hard time of your life. I don't need to tell you that. I've been there myself, right? You will have more time someday to focus on your health. And all that we can do now is to have some self-love and understanding and just try to eat more of those plants. And if we really focus on these eat more recommendations, in the process, it kind of crowds out some of those things that we're eating that are less healthy for us anyway. So I don't want us to focus necessarily on restricting, but focusing on the things that we should be eating more of, like I said, in the process, can help us cut out some of those foods that perhaps we should be eating less of. So this is our nutrition guideline for plant-forward eating. And with that, we have a pretty good idea of what healthy looks like. So the next step, if we want to cook and eat healthy food, is to find some healthy recipes.